Right. Welcome, everyone. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that if you prefer to participate today in Spanish, please select the Spanish channel by clicking the language that you would like to hear. Options for this meeting are English and Spanish. To only hear the interpreted language, please click Mute Original Audio. Please note that since we are presenting and translating today from the same space, there might be longer pausing than usual. So antes de comenzar, solo quiero recordarles a todos que si prefieren participar hoy en español, seleccionen el canal en español haciendo clic en el idioma que les gustaría escuchar. Las opciones para esta reunión son inglés y español. Para escuchar solo el idioma interpretado, haga clic en silenciar audio original. Tenga en cuenta que dado que hoy presentamos y traducimos desde el mismo espacio, es posible que haya pausas más largas de lo habitual. Thank you all for joining us today. This is our first workshop to explore concepts for transport refrigeration units, or TRUs. My name is Gaby Enriquez, and I am facilitating the workshop today that begins the discussion on transitioning non-truck TRUs to zero-emission technology. So now let me introduce the team. So I have with me today Alyssa Rhodes, Lorenzo Bustos, and Catherine Garrison, who will help me present today. And we'll also have Sam Damasa that will help me moderate the discussions and the activities. The meeting today is being recorded, and the slide deck is available in our webpage. Please note that if you download the slide deck, you will be able to have access to all of the links in the presentation. We want to remind everyone to please make sure that you are muted unless you're speaking. We also ask you to please rename yourself so we can see your first name, last name, and affiliation, just like the example on the screen. You can rename yourself by clicking your name under the participant list, selecting More, and then clicking Rename. If you need assistance, please send us a message using the chat function. Please use the chat function to participate throughout the workshop today. To use the chat, click the chat icon and choose who to send the message to. We recommend making sure everyone is selected. Note that all chats are archived. If you would like to take a second to make sure that it works for you, you can go ahead and type hi or something else in the chat. If you have any questions now, feel free to share those as well. You can submit questions or comments in the chat at any point. So I'm going to make a quick pause here to make sure that chat works for you. All right. The other option to participate today is to raise your hand to request to speak. You can do this by either pressing reactions and raise hand, or under the participant button, there should be an option as well. Please remember to state your name and affiliation before you ask a question or share a comment. If you are calling in by phone, for some reason, Start 9 does not seem to work for raising your hand. So if you wish to speak, please unmute yourself using Start 6 and staff will call on you. There will be dedicated time throughout the presentation to take questions and comments. We plan to alternate between taking verbal and written comments. If for some reason your comment or question is not addressed today, you can always send it to us after the workshop. We will have contact information available at the end of the presentation. The workshop today will start with background information on non-truck TRUs to provide context for the discussion. We would like to share the pre-regulation development efforts that the team has been working on. We will review the current state of zero-emission technology and discuss infrastructure for zero-emission non-truck. Afterward, we'll discuss ideas for concepts, share some additional resources, including funding opportunities, and then we will conclude with the next steps. We're looking to work with you all as we develop the next set of requirements for TRUs. Any information or data that you share to help us consider your needs will be helpful as we move forward. Well, we also have questions for you. Sorry, I had a notification here from Zoom. We also have questions for you and requests for information throughout the presentation. Please feel free to drop responses in the chat as they come up, and we can address them as we reach Q&A breaks. So now I'll discuss some background on TRUs and information on the existing TRU airborne toxic control measure. Addressing diesel and other emissions from freight equipment, including TRUs, is critical to helping CARB meet its mission to protect public health and fight climate change. This slide here summarizes CARB's main goals for addressing freight equipment, including the non-truck TRUs. First, we need to meet the Governor's Executive Order N-79-20 to transition off-road equipment, including TRUs, to zero emission by 2035. We also need to attain our regional air quality standards. To support the state implementation plan and meet the standards, CARB committed to developing a measure in the latest SIP strategy to transition non-truck TRUs to zero-emission technology. CARB also needs to achieve emissions reductions to reduce health risks to California communities, and to achieve the state's climate change goals that are laid out in the scoping plan and short-lived climate pollutant reduction strategy documents. CARB has an existing rule to address diesel TRU emissions, called the TRU Airborne Toxic Control Measure, or TRU ATCM, which was adopted in 2004 and has been amended 3 times. To meet the directive of the Governor's Executive Office, we are transitioning the diesel-powered TRUs to zero emission in 2 parts. The most recent amendments to the TRU ATCM were adopted in 2022 and known as TRU Part 1. They include zero-emission truck TRU requirements because the operational characteristics of truck TRUs and the state of technology allowed us to require zero-emission truck TRUs sooner than the non-truck TRUs. Part 1 included other key elements, but discussing TRU Part 1 is not the focus today. If you have questions about the TRU Part 1, you can send them to the email arbor@arb.ca.gov, which should be used for TRU Part 1 only. Staff are not starting to think through potential ideas to meet the commitment made in the 2022 state SIP strategy to transition the non-truck TRUs to zero-emission technology, which we call TRU Part 2. The commitment included board consideration in 2026 and implementation in 2028. The goal for the workshop today is to explore ideas for concepts to transition non-truck TRUs to zero-emission technology. Non-truck TRUs are refrigeration units used on trailers, shipping containers, and rail cars to control the environment of temperature-sensitive products like food, flowers, and pharmaceuticals. They also include TRU generator sets, which are mounted to refrigerated international shipping containers and provide electricity to the container while not plugged into a ship or shore power. TRUs are used on trucks too, but because TRU Part 1 already includes zero-emission requirements for truck TRUs, we will only discuss non-truck TRUs today. And just to further clarify, when we refer to a TRU, it is the actual refrigeration unit only and does not include the container, the tractor that pulls the container, or the chassis that the container might be transported on. Most non-truck TRUs are still diesel-powered and emit fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, oxides of nitrogen, or NOx, and greenhouse gases, or GHGs. These emissions impact air quality, community health, and the climate, which is why we need to address them. So here's a slide showing what all of the different non-truck TRUs look like. The TRU generator sets have a few different configurations. The clip-on, which is shown on the picture, underslung, and power packs. Here is the non-truck TRU population that operated in California in 2022 based on our TRU emissions inventory. In 2022, there were approximately 200,000 non-truck TRUs that operated in California, with the majority being trailer TRUs. These numbers do not include the truck TRU population. The non-truck TRU population directly corresponds to the TRU emissions inventory. In total, in 2022, non-truck TRUs emitted about 185 tons per year of PM2.5 and about 5,200 tons per year of NOx. To put TRU emissions into context, 9 TRUs can emit as much PM as a 2010 or newer model year truck, and 3 TRUs can emit as much NOx as 2 diesel engine trucks. As seen in the graphs on the right, over 90% of the PM2.5 and NOx emissions are attributed to the trailer TRUs. We need to address emissions from all of the non-truck TRUs, but trailer TRUs emit the majority. For the new regulatory effort, we plan to update the baseline emissions inventory. Our goal is to publish an initial draft baseline by early 2024 and freeze and not make any new changes to the baseline inventory after 2024. This freeze means no further changes will be made until the next inventory update. The purpose is to reduce the need to make last-minute regulation analyses updates down the line. The next inventory update could potentially be for another rulemaking impacting TRUs or another CARB effort that involves updating the statewide inventory. We will do an in-depth discussion on updates to the TRU inventory in a future workshop, but we are considering potential updates now. Some of the potential updates include the operated assumptions of facilities, the level of TRU activity in and out of the state, and the age and population of TRUs. If you have any recommendations for additional sources of data to update the baseline inventory, please share them with Liz Masminian, who works on the TRU emissions inventory. Her email is here on the slide. So we'll take a break here. We have about 5 minutes or so to take your questions or comments. You can raise your hand or type in the chat, and Sam will call on you. If we do not get to your question now, we can answer it in the chat, or we can try to revisit later if there is time. As mentioned, we will have questions that we would like your input on. We want to emphasize the need to collaborate with industry so that we better understand your operations and considerations to address moving forward. If you would prefer to share with us offline, you can submit your contact info to us or let us know at the end of the workshop, where we'll have a survey.
Thanks, Gabby. Just as a reminder, please state your name and affiliation when you're asking a question. I saw Dean's hand up. Dean, I've just asked you to unmute. Go ahead and unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question.
Yeah, could you please repeat some things, especially like how many units there were, what were their tons per day, and your analogies that you made? Yeah, you went kind of fast. I didn't catch all that.
Yeah, of course. So it was this slide. So this is based on the 2022 TRU emissions inventory. So in that year, we had approximately 200,000 non-truck TRUs operating in the state, with the majority of those being trailer TRUs. Then the non-truck TRU's emissions that I mentioned were 185 tons per year of PM 2.5 and 5,200 tons per year of NOx. And then the graphs here on the right, the two smaller ones are just showing that over 90% of the PM 2.5 and NOx emissions are from trailer TRUs.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dean. Next, I'm going to move to Daniel Chandler in the chat. Daniel asks, are you planning to regulate the refrigerants too, for example, to require cryogenics? We will have a section later in the slides, Daniel, covering refrigerants. The answer right now is that's something we're trying to determine if we should do. Will Barrett, I see you have your hand raised. I've asked you to unmute yourself. Go ahead and ask your question when ready.
Hi, thank you. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
I'm Will Barrett with the American Lung Association, and really just a comment. On the slide mentioning all the rationale, the justifications for moving this forward, one of the things that was missing was cancer risk reduction. Certainly there was references to air quality and improvements, but this being Lung Cancer Awareness Month, I thought it was important to point out that the prior version of the rule had major cancer risk reductions up to 70%, depending on what type of facility was being served by the TRUs. So we're encouraged very much that CARB is moving forward with this policy now, moving up forward with the inventory, looking at ways to better control emissions from this harmful class of emissions, and really look forward to participating in the process. And really just thank you for that. And just wanted to add that note that there are major cancer risk reduction potential on the table here, and I encourage you to maximize that to the extent possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. Next, we have another comment in the chat. Russell Chaplin. How many clip-on and underslung gensets make up the 200,000 units mentioned statewide? Russell, I will get you a number in a moment. I don't have it off the top of my head, so I'll post that in the chat when I have that available. Next up, we have Adam Hill. There's confusion concerning the use of power generated from the axles of non-truck vehicles. Will California allow this feature as a source for charging batteries for zero-emission electric TRUs? That's something that we're still determining, Adam. Right now, we don't have a definitive answer for you just yet.
And just real quick, before there's another question, the meeting is being recorded. I know I got a couple notifications to record, so we are recording this, and then we'll be posting the recordings, both English and Spanish, in our webpage after the workshop.
So Russell, to come back to your question about the generator sets, per our TRU emissions inventory, we have about 20,000. That includes both in-state and out-of-state. Okay, it looks like we don't have any questions at this time. We're going to move on to the next section. Oh, sorry, we have one that just showed up. Gregory Moreland asks, your photos did not show fuel storage locations. What is the typical placement of the diesel tanks? Gregory, if you're referring to the TRUs specifically, on trailer TRUs, the diesel tank is mounted underneath the trailer. Other TRU types, it's in a different spot. So for example, on the like domestic shipping containers, it's underneath the TRU. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly though. And just as a reminder to everyone, please, when you ask a question, please also state your affiliation. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section. Terrence, I see your hand up. Are you able to wait until we get to the next question section? If you have a more urgent question, you can type it in the chat as well. Lorenzo, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, everyone. My name is Lorenzo. I'm an air resources engineer with CARB. I'll start the discussion on our next section, which is on pre-regulation development work. Since 2022, staff have been conducting stakeholder outreach to learn about non-truck TRU fleet operations and available zero-emission technologies. In 2023, staff began site visits to refrigerated warehouses and distribution centers, cold storage warehouses, seaports, and rail yards. Staff have been attending zero-emission technology demonstrations to see some of these zero-emission TRU projects. And staff have been conducting meetings with OEMs, technology providers, and fleets. And we plan to continue conducting outreach. So if you have a product to share, or if you would like staff to come out and learn about your operations, please let us know. Staff are also conducting community-focused outreach. In 2022, staff developed a community engagement plan as part of CARB's commitment to increase the community's participation during regulation development. The purpose of the community engagement plan is to partner with the communities thoughtfully and intentionally throughout the regulation development process. The plan includes different outreach activities, some of which we have already started for TRU Part 2. Some of these activities include community-focused events, like the one we held in September. That event provided information on TRUs and the CARB regulatory process. Another activity is environmental justice tours, which staff are planning to begin there soon. Staff also plan to host office hours starting in early 2025. And staff plans to host one every few months throughout the development process up until board consideration. In addition to outreach, staff conducted a few pre-regulation development research projects. Staff developed a technology assessment of zero-emission technologies for the non-truck TRUs. This document looked at the state of battery electric TRUs, hydrogen fuel cell TRUs, cryogenic TRU systems, and range extending technologies. It also contained requests for additional information on costs, operations, projects, and general product information. The 2022 technology assessment was posted in October 2022 after it was workshopped in May of 2022. Last year, staff also developed a survey for non-truck TRU fleet owners and operators in coordination with the Foundation for California Community Colleges. The goal of the survey was to learn more about the operations of the non-truck TRU fleets. This survey was shared with over 7,000 non-truck TRU fleets registered with CARB's online TRU registration program, Arbor, and concluded last year. This survey had an overall response rate of about 5%. 98% of the responses received were from trailer TRU fleets. We are interested in what your thoughts are about the data we received, which I'll go over now. We learned that most trailer TRU fleets have daily routes that are completed before returning to their home-based facility. Those routes, on average, are longer than 10 hours. The average number of stops per route is 1 to 2, with the average duration of a stop being about 3 to 4 hours. We learned that most of the trailer TRU fleets have loads that need to maintain chill temperatures of about 35 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. And these trailer TRUs use about 6 to 12 gallons of diesel fuel daily. In addition to operations, there were questions about fleet makeup. So most trailer TRU fleets said that they kept their TRUs for 9 years or less, with 32% that said they kept their TRUs for 10 years or longer. We also had questions about TRUs operating at the fleet's home-based facilities to help understand the need for infrastructure. 21% of respondents indicated that they did not have a home-based facility. Most of the trailer TRU fleets with a home-based facility indicated that their home-based facility serves 5 or fewer TRUs at a given time. So we're curious on what your initial reactions to these results are. And please feel free to drop responses in the chat now. In addition to what we have already learned, we would like to continue collecting as much operational information and data on non-truck TRU fleets as possible. Examples of some of the information we are looking for include: what do duty cycles look like for you? How much time is spent in state versus out of state? We would also like any information that can help us characterize operations, such as what segment your business operates in, or what type of business you are. Staff are also interested in collecting more data from applicable facilities to update TRU operation assumptions at facilities, and to build a picture of what typical daily operations look like. So, for example, how many TRUs visit daily? How many TRUs are on site at a given time? Where are these TRUs parking? And how long do they generally wait for? So we're interested in hearing from industry on how we can get a better understanding for these types of questions. So what are your suggestions for how you'd like to be engaged? Would posting a list of questions be helpful, or resending the survey we did, or would meeting individually or in groups be helpful? So please feel free to share today, or you can reach out to our freight email. That's freight@arb.ca.gov, and we can follow up. And again, anything you share with us will be helpful for developing TRU Part 2. Now that we have shared what we've been working on, do you have any recommendations? Or are there other types of outreach efforts you would like to see from us? We'd also like to hear more about what your operations look like, and if you have any thoughts on the survey results. please raise your hand or you can submit your responses in the chat.
Thanks, Lorenzo. And once again, just a reminder for everyone to please state your affiliation when asking questions. We've received quite a few in the chat. We'll go in the order that we received them. First question we have from Dory Chandler. Did you also ask about load capacity and what percentage of the vehicle was full / the amount of time it was full or empty? Lorenzo, could you answer that question?
Sure. No, the survey did not include that question. We were somewhat limited on the amount of information we can ask for, but that is one piece of information we'd like to collect. So if anyone has that type of information, please feel free to share that with us. That would be helpful. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, and just to tack onto that, we do have a freight email if you want to share data with us, if it's potentially sensitive or confidential in a more private setting. I'll put that in the chat right now, but it's freight@arb.ca.gov. Next, we have a question from Mike Tunnel. The response rate does not seem adequate to draw conclusions. Please discuss how you plan to use the data. So yeah, Mike, you're right in that we didn't get a very high response rate. Do you have any suggestions for us as to how we could potentially reach out again and have more participation, get higher response rates, get better data? Anything you're able to provide would be very helpful in that regard. Next, we have a question from Adam Hill. Your data is true in many cases. However, fleets must design their fleets not for the norm, but for the extremes. Adam, that's something that we haven't necessarily heard too much, and we'd like to follow up with you on that. You can either reach out to our freight email or potentially we could reach out to you. Just let us know whichever you'd prefer. That's something we'd like to follow up with you on. Next, we have a question from Eric Lucht. What's the status of infrastructure needed to support zero-emission units? Catherine, is that a question you're able to respond to?
Yes. In a little bit, we're going to be talking about some of those technology projects for the zero emission. And right now, the status is that the fleets that have been deploying the zero emission TRU units have been installing the infrastructure at their home base of operation. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Catherine. Next, we have a hand raised from James Frey. James, I've just asked you to unmute yourself. Go ahead and ask your question when ready. And just as a reminder, please state your affiliation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Fry. I work for 2050 Partners, and we do research for nonprofits related to electrification of everything, including this. We did a report on TRUs for them that they use for their own inside information. But I have two questions. One is, how are you engaging with the TRU manufacturers to create an agreement to download telematics data in an anonymized fashion so we can learn really interesting things about mission profiles and such? So that's the first question. And then the second one is, are you considering the envelope of the trailer as a item to quantify its current performance in general, and then possibly improving trailer envelopes like we try to improve building envelopes to assure that we get good, efficient operation out of these trailers? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Could you, just before you go back on mute, could you elaborate on what you mean by the envelope? It's not a term I'm familiar with.
Thank you. In this case, it's the trailer enclosure is a typically a refrigerated box with insulation, and it's got air sealing and a bunch of accessories to make sure that the cold air stays in during loading and unloading. And these things can really make or break electrification of these. So the idea is to, like you would treat a building carefully before you make it more efficient inside, you would make the outside more efficient by making sure that it's not leaky and it's insulated correctly. Thanks.
So effectively better insulation for the trailer.
And sealing and a good door. And the
Okay.
idea that an open door during loading and unloading can crush all of your careful kilowatts that you're using to pre-cool the material inside. So the idea is how to handle door use, and the telematics can actually be very insightful about behaviors on your load and unload crews and stuff.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, to comment on the trailer, that would not be under our rule. We're focusing specifically on the TRUs. So there's different rules in CARB that focus on the trailers. As for engaging with manufacturers on telematics data, that's something that we could probably discuss at a later date. It's not really something we're prepared to talk about at the moment. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section. We still have some outstanding questions. We'll get to those either in the chat as we're going through the next part of the presentation or during the next Q&A session. Lorenzo, back to you.
Thanks again, Sam. Before we discuss ideas on moving non-truck TRUs to zero emission, we want to do a brief high-level review of zero emission technology for non-truck TRUs that staff are aware of. This chart sourced from our 2022 TRU technology assessment shows the status and availability of zero emission technologies for non-truck TRUs that staff are aware of. Please note this chart does not include range extending technologies, only zero emission non-truck TRUs. Though we are aware that there are several range extending technologies being trialed with trailer TRUs, and they are showing results in extending battery range. As of 2023, battery electric solutions for trailer TRUs have the most progress and are being trialed. We know of at least 8 zero-emission trailer TRU solutions that are either available for purchase or in development in the United States. Half are battery electric TRUs, and the other half are cryogenic TRU systems. We are unaware of any hydrogen fuel cell solutions in development. But if there are any hydrogen fuel cell or other zero emission TRU products in development for TRUs, please let us know. We're also aware of a few battery electric solutions for TRU generator sets. One is available for purchase, and the other is in the early stages of development. To date, we are not aware of any past or ongoing zero-emission technologies demonstrated for domestic shipping container or railcar TRU applications. So we are seeking information on any new pilots of any new TRU technologies, but especially for those non-trailer TRUs. We realize zero-emission technologies for non-truck TRUs are generally in the earlier stages of development or don't have solutions yet. But staff will continue to work with manufacturers to meet implementation date goals and will consider the state of technology. For more details on existing, available, and developing zero-emission technologies, please see our 2022 TRU technology assessment linked on slide 17. So this table shows our estimated costs for capital purchases per unit for the different zero-emission TRU technologies and associated infrastructure. The purchase of zero-emission units is currently more expensive compared to their diesel counterparts. However, we generally expect this cost gap to decrease as these new technologies advance and as production increases. And we plan to discuss cost inputs and assumptions for zero-emission non-truck TRUs in more detail at a future workshop. As you saw on the last table, we have some data gaps we would like to close. To help inform our cost estimates, we are interested in additional cost information for both zero-emission TRUs and for infrastructure. So data we are looking for includes zero-emission TRU capital costs for both the TRU and range extending technologies, infrastructure capital costs, associated zero-emission TRU and infrastructure maintenance and operating costs, any impacts to operation costs from the heavier batteries, impacts to insurance rates, and technology useful life. We're also happy to receive any additional information to what is listed here. So does anyone have information that they can share today, or are there any reactions to the costs we do have? We're also happy to meet privately to discuss, or you can share in the chat now. And now I'll pass it to Catherine, who will talk about infrastructure.
Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Catherine Garrison. I'm an Air Resources Engineer with CARB, and I'm here to talk about the infrastructure. Before we discuss ideas for moving non-truck TRUs to zero emission, we also wanted to share some information about zero emission infrastructure for non-truck TRUs. California is driving forward with zero-emission technologies to achieve our clean air, community risk reduction, and climate goals. In the last few years, CARB has adopted many zero-emission regulations, including those for zero-emission truck TRUs, trucks, and locomotives. Facilities will need charging and hydrogen fueling infrastructure to support the various zero-emission freight equipment requirements. Energy planning agencies and electric utilities are working to ensure that the electrical grid can support future energy needs of zero-emission equipment. There are many partners involved in making the zero-emission infrastructure ecosystem work, from communities, fuel providers, government agencies, infrastructure companies, equipment and vehicle manufacturers, and end users. It is important for us to all work together. In April, CARB, the California Energy Commission, and 6 other state departments and agencies signed a joint statement of intent to help guide planning for energy supplies, grid improvements, and development of hydrogen stations and vehicle chargers. This document outlines the state's shared approach to ensuring that there is enough electricity and hydrogen supply. One of these state agencies, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, or GOBIZ, was directed this summer by Governor Newsom to develop California's hydrogen market development strategy to build up California's clean, renewable hydrogen market. Last month, it was announced that California will receive up to $1.2 billion from the United States Department of Energy to accelerate the development and deployment of clean, renewable hydrogen. This is fantastic news since it will increase the supply of hydrogen fuel in the state. The infrastructure process is generally divided into 3 main steps: plan, design, install. From start to finish, these steps could take anywhere from 4 to 6 months to more than 3 years. This time frame depends on many factors that are tied to each individual site. This slide focuses on the flow of the infrastructure planning process. The 3 main steps to the planning process includes the zero-emission equipment, fuel, and project scope. In the first box, we have what technology will meet the temperature delivery needs. How will this equipment work? What is the most cost-effective choice? The second box focuses on fueling infrastructure. How many hours of infrastructure operation will the fleets require? What time of day will the zero-emission equipment need to be refueled? The third box provides emphasis on the project scope. What are the necessary site improvements? Who is the local government or authority having jurisdiction to process permits? What permits are required? Building, electrical, fire, other. The next step focuses on the main design elements to be included in the infrastructure improvements. For demonstration purposes, this slide and the next will focus on the assumption that the zero-emission fuel will be electricity, although cryogenic technology may work for your operational needs. When addressing the design elements, a fleet needs to determine the number of dock doors and staging areas that are needed to support zero-emission technology. When assessing that need, consider the site flow patterns for parking and fueling the TRUs. Coordinate with the utility to determine infrastructure upgrades. Include necessary site electrical improvements with an eye for the future and possible growth. Fleets also need to consider ways to reduce costs, which I'll talk about more on the next slide. The design phase is a great opportunity to evaluate ways to reduce new construction costs. Locating infrastructure close to the incoming power will save money by reducing trenching costs. Laying conduit now that is anticipated for future use will save costs associated with trenching and repaving a second time. Consider reducing fueling costs by installing rooftop solar and/or battery storage. Use smart chargers or other energy management systems to reduce your electricity costs. The third step is accumulation of the planning and design steps. Once the plans are approved and the permits secured, the construction begins. Early coordination with the utility will help to ensure that once equipment is installed, all that remains is to flip the switch in order to support zero-emission technologies. Taking a break here, does anyone have any questions or comments of any of the material that was presented? And I think we may have some already in the chat.
Yep, thanks, Catherine. We definitely do. apologies to anyone if I happen to miss your question. Just please type it again or raise your hand again. And as always, just a reminder to state your affiliation when you ask your question. I believe some of these have already been answered. I have a question from Jonathan Dow. How is shore power being approached for hybrid and electric units? It could serve as a solution for idling and pulling down temperatures. So Jonathan, we thought about that under a previous version of the current TRU ATCM back during rulemaking for that. But for the current effort, we're directed by Executive Order in 7920 to bring all TRUs to zero emission where feasible by 2035. So that's our focus, is zero emission operation. We have heard some of the manufacturers are looking into shore power for charging battery electric TRUs. So that might be something that we'll see in the future.
Yes, I would just add that the shore power, as Sam said, some of the zero emission technology providers are finding that it's a great way to help with that trailer pull down, which is very energy intensive. Thank you for the question, and thank you, Sam.
Yeah. James, I'll get to you in just one moment. We have a question from Michelle Guerin with Port of San Diego. Producing cryogenic fluids involves large amounts of energy. The difference in temperature between the fluid and the refrigeration temperature needed is high. Is there an emissions reduction in using cryogenic refrigeration when considering the total process, or is it actually an emissions increase? So Michelle, to comment on your question, for the purposes of our regulation, we're looking at exhaust emissions, so think tank to wheel. There's other efforts and inventories at CARB that look at the well to wheel or well to tank emissions, and we separate those out so that we avoid any sort of double counting issues. Let's see. All right. James, I've given you permission to unmute yourself. Go ahead and unmute and then ask your question when ready.
Thank you very much. This question is related to the shore power question, and that is, if, as you're characterizing trailer TRUs that are passing through the state on the way to elsewhere, will there be some specific focus on truck stops that are on these major routes for the infrastructure that might be helpful to keep these battery TRUs topped up, or keep them at the right temperature overnight? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine, is that something you'd like to answer?
Yes, it is. That's a great question. We do know that many folks have expressed interest in providing charging for trucks that are moving throughout the state. So some of those truck stops, even some different truck manufacturers have invested in that infrastructure. And I think it would be great if when those investments are being put in, if there was some infrastructure put in for those TRU units. Yes, that's a great idea. And CARB is definitely working with our state partner agencies as well as with our federal partners, and elevating that need. And as I mentioned before, in the ecosystem for infrastructure, it takes a big collaborative effort. And if you guys think that's a great need, then I would definitely recommend that you promote that. Thank you, James.
You're welcome. To follow on quickly, is the as these visiting truck trailers arrive at a station, it'll be very important that there's a standard connection that is used to make these visitors content with the connection. So it'll be helpful if CARB collects industry understand what those standards are looking like related to the shore power connection, and make sure that you're doing everything you can to promote closure on any of the types of standards that may not be quite locked yet, but could use a strong market push for closure. Thanks.
Thank you, James. We have a question in the chat from Daniel Chandler. I did not see that you are considering propane as a refrigerant. Please see Rammaub M and Zhangji Huan, testing and performance evaluation of R404A transport refrigeration system retrofitted with R290 in AIUE proceedings of the 17th Industrial and Commercial Use of Energy ICUE Conference 2019. So Daniel, we are going to talk a little bit about refrigerant on slide 44, about the potential for a requirement around lower global warming potential refrigerant. So that might address your question when we get to it a little bit later. I'm not seeing any additional questions at this time. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next section, and that would be Alyssa.
Great, thank you, Sam. Hi, everybody. I'm Alyssa Rhodes, and I'm an air pollution specialist here at CARB. I'll now discuss some ideas that need to be explored to develop concepts to transition non-truck TRUs to zero emission. We're very interested in what your input is here so we can coordinate and develop the next set of requirements together. So if you have any thoughts or ideas as we go through our ideas for concepts, please feel free to drop them into the chat. So here's a high-level tentative timeline for TRU Part 2 that includes goals and what we plan to work on for the next couple of years. The workshop today is the first of many public workshops that we plan to host as we move towards regulation development. We do plan to host additional workshops to discuss refined concepts and alternatives, the baseline emissions inventory, and regulatory language. Once we begin to discuss potential alternatives, we will post the CEQA notice of preparation that notes the start of the environmental analysis. As mentioned earlier, we plan to begin updating the TRU baseline emissions inventory in 2024, and we plan to freeze any additional changes by the end of 2024. And also, as we mentioned, any additional changes after then will need to wait until the next inventory update. Also in 2024, we plan to begin the cost analysis and the health risk assessment. And this timing aligns with our SIP commitment measure to present a non-truck TRU measure to the board for consideration in 2026 and to begin implementation by 2028. So one of the key elements that may carry over from TRU Part 1 is an applicable facilities registration and reporting requirement. For TRU Part 1, it included refrigerated warehouses or distribution centers that have a building size of 20,000 square feet or greater, grocery stores with a building size of 15,000 square feet or greater, seaport facilities, and intermodal rail yards. In total, there are about 6,000 applicable facilities in California based on this definition. And the requirement requires facility owners to report all TRUs that operate at their facility to CARB quarterly, or alternatively, they can certify that only compliant TRUs will operate at their facility. It's important to note that the new requirements will not only address zero-emission technology for non-truck TRUs, but they also provide us an opportunity to build on or improve the requirements that are in TRU Part 1. So based on your experience from starting implementation for Part 1, Are there any updates that you think that we should consider for part 2 as we move forward? Please let us know in the chat. As we start to explore concepts, here's a list of considerations that we are keeping in mind, and note these are in no particular order. So we're looking at impacts to air quality and community health, since that's CARB's main mission. And then other considerations include availability and reliability of technology to support TRU fleet duty cycles and their operations. We want to make sure that technology allows fleets to adhere to the requirements that are in the Food Safety Modernization Act in order to minimize potential losses. We're also keeping in mind cost too, since we do realize that zero-emission technology is expensive. However, we will also consider monetized benefits from transitioning to zero-emission technology, in addition to those costs that will be incurred from implementation. Staff will consider the monetized health benefits from reduced exposure to fine particulate matter. And then generally, when we conduct our cost analysis, our estimates look at the total costs that are incurred from both in-state and the out-of-state activity. And while we are planning to look at these total costs, we are proposing for part 2 to analyze the costs of implementation for only in-state activity, since we only account for the emission reduction benefits that are gained in-state. And finally, we're also keeping in mind how other regulatory requirements or requirements that are in development might impact the non-truck TRUs. For example, we have coordinated with the Tier 5 rulemaking staff to help reduce the number of times that the TRU OEMs will have to redesign their TRUs. So before we discuss the ideas that we have, are there any other considerations that you think that we should think of or about as we move forward? In order to help us understand priorities, we've set up an activity in a poll everywhere activity, and you can access it using the link that we'll drop in the chat, or if you have your phone on you, you can scan the QR code. So we're asking if you can please submit anything else that we should be considering, or if you see other answers that you like, you can feel free just to upvote those as well. And then we'll spend maybe like 3 or 5 minutes or so on this activity. So give a second while answers trickle in. And if you're having any issues accessing the activity, please let us know in the chat. Okay, so it looks like we do have one answer so far. It says, we appreciate the air quality and public health are top considerations. Thank you. We'll give it another couple minutes to see if we get some other answers or responses. Okay, it says we should be considering backup systems to prevent load losses in the event of battery running out, for example. Yes, thank you for that comment. That is something that CARB staff are thinking through. Looks like we got another response, impacts on facilities from the other TRU regs, as well as other CARB regulations and zero emission requirements. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your responses. And just to reiterate, we do appreciate your feedback, since this is a time for us to hear your input and for you guys to weigh in early before we just actually start the rulemaking, and so we can work together to get that together. Okay, I think we will go ahead and move on. So here's the list of categories for concepts that staff are considering. We'll cover each one in more detail over the next few slides. So the first idea to help us meet the governor's executive order is a zero-emission manufacturing requirement paired with an annual fleet turnover requirement to zero-emission units. The goal is to start implementation for at least zero-emission manufacturing in 2028. And this timing aligns again with the TRU measure that was in the 2022 SIP strategy. The idea is that starting in 2028, manufacturers would produce only zero-emission non-truck TRUs. And then at or around the same time, non-truck TRU owners or operators would begin to turn over their fleet to zero-emission technology. And the mechanism for turnover to zero emission could be either a number or a percentage of the fleet annually. TRU Part 1 had a similar turnover requirement, but since the useful life for non-trucks and truck TRUs is different, it might not look exactly the same. The TRU emissions inventory has an average useful life for trailer TRUs, and the TRU generator sets is closer to 10 years. And domestic shipping container TRUs and railcar TRUs have an average useful life closer to 6 years. Another consideration is that the different classes of non-truck TRUs have different types of routes and duty cycles and modes of operation. So we are looking for input on what turnover should look like for the different non-truck TRUs. And they can be considered either altogether or separately. So for transitioning to zero-emission technology, it will be important to ensure that technology is reliable and capable of meeting performance expectations. To help fleets feel comfortable purchasing zero-emission technology, one option is to ask the OEMs to meet zero-emission certification requirements or certain approval criteria. So there's not an official CARB off-road certification process yet, but for TRUs, the OEMs could be asked to meet requirements that are similar to the existing on-road zero-emission powertrain certification process that's known as ZEP-Cert. The on-road ZEP-Cert establishes requirements and optional emission standards for 2021 and subsequent model year medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles, as well as for the zero-emission powertrains that are installed in those vehicles. Manufacturers apply with CARB by providing product descriptions and other required data. And then the manufacturers must also meet other requirements that include things like capacity testing, labels, and selling repair tools. TRU Part 2 can ask OEMs to undergo a similar certification process, or another option would be to have the OEMs include assurances that would need to be offered for the zero-emission non-truck TRUs. And this would be similar to what Part 1 requires. The zero-emission assurances that are included in TRU Part 1 include offering a comprehensive warranty and offering at least one service repair center in California. So staff are seeking input on what your preferred approach is. Let us know, what do you all need to feel comfortable to purchase zero-emission TRU technology? And staff are also considering exploring a lower global warming potential standard for refrigerant than what's required by Part 1. This idea would apply to newly manufactured TRUs, and the reason to include it would be to achieve further emission reductions from refrigerant usage. The requirement from TRU Part 1 is to use a refrigerant with a global warming potential of less than or equal to 2200, or no refrigerant at all. And staff are aware that Carrier did some testing of natural refrigerants for transport applications, but that was over 5 years ago. So staff are interested in what your thoughts are on lowering the standard ahead of the SB 1206 sale requirements, or if you know of any more recent testing for the use of natural refrigerant for transport purposes. And then another idea for a concept to help meet the governor's executive order is for non-truck TRU fleets to report to CARB about their operations while they're en route and while they're at facilities. TRU Part 1 only requires owners to report the units that operate in California to CARB, regardless of where they're based, but it does not require reporting on the operations. If certain fleets will not transition to zero emission until later, collecting operating data now will help staff update the technology assessment or potentially the transition requirement in the future. So not every fleet would necessarily have to be subject to the reporting requirement. It would likely be dependent on what the transition requirement ends up looking like. And so reporting could maybe be a one-time event, like the 2021 large entity reporting requirement from the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, or it could be another frequency. So if there is a reporting requirement, the requested data would be similar to what we collected in the non-truck fleet survey, and that contained questions on topics like route characteristics, operating times, fueling operations, and then questions about the equipment. So we want to know, is operation information something that you would be willing to share with us? Please let us know why or why not. All right, so we've now reached another discussion point, and I think we have about 30 minutes to discuss these concept categories, or if you have any other ideas for potential concepts. Again, we'll do our best to get to everyone. And if you do wish to make a comment or ask a question, please raise your hand and Sam can call on you and unmute you.
Yep. And actually, Alyssa, we've got two questions that I think are up your alley. If we could go back to slide 43, I believe. First one from Felicia Barnes. Are these options that industry can choose or alternative regulatory structures that CARB is considering?
So these would be two different structure options that CARB's considering, but we're interested in hearing all of your feedback on what you think would be the most helpful or make you feel the most comfortable. So none of these ideas that we presented today are like decided on. This is all like ideas that we need your input and feedback on.
And then second question, and this may be answered just by us being on this slide, from Eric Lucht. He asks, please repeat the ZE-TRU certification requirements. Eric, let us know if we've addressed your question. Okay, it looks like we don't have any additional questions at this time. Actually, we do, sorry. Jacqueline, I see you have your hand raised. I've just asked you to unmute. Go ahead and ask your question when ready.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, all. This is Jacqueline Moore from PMSA. Alyssa, one question for you. For your slide on fleet operations reporting, is CARB proposing that to be the TRU owner or the TRU operator? Or is that not decided as of yet?
So nothing's 100% decided, but we would likely follow Part 1 where the responsibility would ultimately fall on the owner, but they could designate to the operator.
Okay, understood. this may be different for, different types of business models out there. Owners may not have all this information at hand. Sometimes it's up to the operators at the facilities themselves or vice versa. So I wanted to point that out. Not telematics aren't greatly deployed for TRUs, at least as of yet. So I think that's one issue to consider there is you can access that information. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then I saw the next question appear in chat from Adam Carey. Does CARB have a definition on what qualifies as zero emissions? So for Adam, the answer for this current regulatory development is not yet. But for the previous TRU regulation, the one that's currently in effect, to summarize, it's effectively zero exhaust emissions or zero tailpipe emissions. Todd, I see that you have your hand raised. I've just asked you to unmute. Go ahead and ask your question when ready.
Hi, Todd Banks, R&B Fresh Express. We're a small California carrier. We've spent a significant amount of money over the last few years to upgrade our fleet, and we're in the always compliant category. Does time end in 2028?
Is there a specific requirement you're referencing by that?
Well, if you go into the ARB site, we show as always compliant. But
Are you talking about Arbor?
Yeah, we're talking but in 2028, does the always compliant go away? So always only means like another few years?
Yeah, so part one questions on the current rule are best directed towards our Arbor email, and I'll put that in the chat. But having worked with Arbor before, always simply means that your compliance is not going to expire under the current rule.
It's a little misleading. From a financial standpoint, that would devastate the company to have to replace everything again in so short a time period.
So the current rule that we're discussing, under that one, when it says always, that just means your compliance doesn't expire under the current rule. As for the part two rule that we're discussing right now, we don't have any requirements set in stone yet, so nothing special necessarily happens in 2028 as of right now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. I see we have another hand raised from Mike Tunnel. Mike, I've just asked you to unmute yourself. Go ahead and ask your question when ready.
Great, thank you. So I think maybe on this 2028 question, one of the slides had a manufacturer, it may be the next slide, it said manufacturers could only sell zero emission units in 2028, which effectively would, fleets that would be the only option, which even if there was a phase in for fleets, they wouldn't be able to buy anything other than zero emission. So it just seems your timing, maybe your slide's off, maybe your timing's off, or maybe it's right, I don't know, but it's kind of confusing on that slide. And I'm not seeing it really pulled up.
Could we go back to that slide?
What slide was it, Sam?
The one that talks about manufacturing. Right there.
Okay.
So, this to me says you would only be able to buy a zero emission non-truck TRU in California beginning 2028. And is that what you actually mean? Or because from a fleet perspective, you can't have all your units. You probably have situations where it couldn't work in zero emission. So, and they don't even do this on the truck under the advanced clean truck rule. It's a phase in. So I'm a little curious to what you mean by this slide.
Yeah, I can try to take that if anyone else wants to jump in. So that, I think what you're getting at is kind of the idea that we were thinking of starting 2028. If there's only zero emission units, then yeah, fleets would have to start purchasing those zero emission units, but they wouldn't be purchasing them like ahead of what they would naturally turn over, if that makes sense, since ideally the turnover requirement would be like kind of based on that like normal useful life or age that's kept. So that's what we're looking for input on, like how long are fleets keeping it, so we can kind of like fine tune that requirement to meet fleets needs and be attuned to what operations currently are. So if you have any like information on like for fleets that it wouldn't work, if you could share that with us, that would be really helpful.
Thanks, Alyssa. Next question, we'll go to James Frey in the chat, and then Gregory will get to your question next. So James asks, although trailer thermal performance is not in scope for this program, it may help with assuring success/acceptance for battery ETRUs. Could you coordinate forces with that CARB group and bring them to co-present with you? Thanks for your comment, James. We'll take that into consideration. Gregory, I've just asked you to unmute yourself. Go ahead and unmute and then ask your question when ready.
Yeah, hi. I'm a Oak Ridge National Lab support contractor to the U.S. Department of Energy, focusing on fuel cell technologies. And these aren't really questions, but they're suggestions. Since you're asking for additional suggestions to consider, just two of them. Duty cycles are very important in this step. They're key to sizing the power generation. They're key to sizing the fuel usage, which means the fuel tank, and they're also key to develop figuring out what the packaging is going to be. Is there space available for the fuel storage and for the power unit, or is it going to affect the payload? Are you going to end up in shrinking the size of the container because of the fuel and the storage? And that's so I think the sooner you get to identifying what the duty cycles are, I think it would help the OEMs figure out how to transition to zero emission. Also, several fuel cell OEMs are developing fuel cell genset products. And this is all sizes of power generation up to megawatt scale. But they're typically for mobility applications like this, they're typically a supplier to an integrator or an OEM or an end use customer. So I think that the fuel cells are further along than you might have seen in your assessments. But getting the fuel cell integrated with the TRU product is going to take a major RD&D effort. But I think this is certainly something that we have studied at DOE. In fact, we studied this 10 years ago and saw a lot of potential for it, and just concluded that it just was too soon to introduce a product like this. But we saw a lot of potential with this.
Yeah, thanks for the comments, Gregory.
And we've also prepared reports on it from some time back, but I don't think much has changed.
Okay, yeah, if you'd like to share those reports with us, reaching out to our freight email would be a good place to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any additional questions at the moment. So, Catherine, you wanted to elaborate a bit on the plug connections for shore power? Oh, Catherine, you're muted, by the way.
Yes, that mute got me. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that when CARB was developing the 2022 amendments, we had a work group focused on the standardization, and the concept back then was, supporting, the use of that stationary operation limits to reduce the emissions. And at that point, we were told by industry that they wanted to figure out what would be the best connector for the shore power connector. And so we stayed out of that. And it's been a while since we had that work group meeting. And I wanted to update the folks that the California Energy Commission is conducting a charger development strategy as part of their annual energy forecasting. And we've been coordinating with them. And we've heard that there's been some interest from the TRU industry on the SAE standard 3068 for a TRU, and that this standard effort will allow flexibility for carrying along a detachable cord that could be used for idle reduction, and also charging capability with up to 480 volts of alternating current. And that has a 7-pin connector. And I wanted to know if anyone else knows of any efforts going on the connector, whether it's for shore power or for like a charging in that TRU space. We're definitely interested in that. And as been mentioned before, you could let us know now, or you could put it into the chat or email us at that freight email. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm gonna answer James Frey's question, and then we'll get to Chris Shimoda next. So James, I guess it's more of a request and less of a question. Please consider exploring adjacent technologies to support success, including integrating phase change materials. Yeah, thanks for the suggestion, James. When we do a regulation like this, we're going to have a zero emission definition in our reg. That's still to be determined. But regardless of what technology is used, so long as it meets that definition, it would be allowed. So if something like that can help a manufacturer meet that zero emission definition, that would definitely be something we'd let them do. Chris, I've just asked you to unmute yourself. Go ahead and unmute and then ask your question when ready.
Great. Thank you, Samuel. So Chris Shimoda with the California Trucking Association, and a little bit of a request for maybe the next workshop or some of the interim analysis that staff is going to do. So I'd encourage a little bit more detail on the technology pathways that CARB sees as the most likely to meet the zero emission manufacturing standard in 2028. We've seen a couple of different approaches from the OEMs that I think are going to present some pretty unique implementation challenges that I would really encourage staff, once you think about these various technology pathways, the things that follow, and a realistic timeline for overcoming some of these challenges. And I'll just use a couple of examples. So we've seen some discussion about using a zero emission truck battery, or if it's a hydrogen fuel cell truck, basically the power plant for the truck serving as the power source for the TRU. So if that is going to be a technology pathway to meet the standard, things to think about is, will these zero emission trucks be available in sufficient number to actually meet that 2028 timeline, given the fact under advanced clean fleets, for instance, if it's an interstate fleet, sleeper cab requirements don't even kick in under that rule if you're using the milestone phase-in until 2030. And even at that point, the infrastructure to actually support those vehicles could be a 7+ year process, which is, not something that the fleet can control whatsoever. And so, just another example, if it is hydrogen, as was discussed prior, we're having a pretty robust discussion about hydrogen infrastructure to support class 7 and 8 trucks. And I think that you'll find it's still pretty early on in the process to say that hydrogen fueling infrastructure is going to be in place in sufficient quantity and type to support that type of operation. And so, we just encourage staff to sort of think through these technology pathways and the interconnectedness with some of these other issues on infrastructure, and especially if the truck deployments are meant to serve as the power plant for these TRUs. There's going to be some pretty interesting timing considerations again that I just encourage staff to really work through before the next workshop. And thank you for the time.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for your suggestions. Just a quick question to everyone in chat. Are there any other folks on the line who have similar considerations that they'd like us to think about moving forward? If so, you can just raise your hand. We'll call on you or let us know in the chat. Next up, we have a question from Jonathan Dow. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. I've just asked you to unmute yourself. Go ahead and unmute and then ask your question when ready.
Hello, I'm Jonathan from ESL Power Systems, and you actually said it correctly. It's Dow. Regarding Catherine's question about the plugs and what might be the future for it. So currently for shore power, we use the IEC 3069, and then for the future of charging, it is true that we might be using 480 volts and alternating current, which is going to use the J3068, which is brought over from Europe. So just a couple of clarifications on that, and I thought that could help. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan, I'm going to lower your hand. I think your question is over. Oh. Okay, looks like you lowered it again. Sorry about that. So it looks like we don't have any questions at this time. I'm going to ask you guys a question. Let us know your thoughts on the matter. So under the current TRU ATCM, a lot of people end up turning over their TRUs after about 7 years. And is that something that's being primarily driven by regulation here? And if not for that, would you keep your TRUs for longer? Do you have any data on how long you generally keep your TRUs before you turn them over, let's say outside of California? And while you guys are thinking about that, we got another question that came in the chat from Ken McIntosh. Are warehouses going to be required to have plugins at each dock door available to plug in while trucks or trailers load and unload? Alyssa, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. So we don't, I guess we've kind of said we don't really have any defined concepts at this point. These are all just some initial ideas. We do, part of our analysis will include looking at the infrastructure that's available and that will be available and what will be needed. So that's something we'll have to consider and look into if there would be need to have a requirement. But if you have any data for us that could help us out with that analysis, or if you have any thoughts you want to share now, that would be helpful. Catherine, did you want to add anything to that?
I muted myself this time. Yeah, that was great, Alyssa. And as Alyssa was saying, we're developing concepts right now. And I just wanted to say that when we were developing the 2022 amendments, we did have a concept we came up with that was supporting that stationary, when the TRU is stationary, for it to be plugged in to, reduce that cancer risk. And And then we decided to, that wasn't meeting the governor's executive order in 7920, asking us to go for zero emission. So we moved away from that concept. And so I just wanted to provide a little bit of history to hopefully connect the dots for you guys. Hope we answered your question.
Thanks, Catherine. We have another question from Jacqueline Moore in the chat. Starts off with thank you, Catherine. I don't believe a specific fuel/infrastructure type should be required, but rather will a facility be required to have available all fuels that may be used for TRUs? Example, a facility has plugs for battery electric TRUs, but a customer then elects to deploy hydrogen TRUs. Will that facility be required to deploy hydrogen infrastructure as well? So Jacqueline, I guess to piggyback off of Alyssa's answer from earlier, we don't have any requirements set in stone just yet. So that's something that's to be determined. If you have any thoughts on which way we should go, please let us know. We have another question in chat from Zeal Tajpuria. Sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong. Will CARB provide any incentives to promote zero-emission TRUs because of the cost difference between an engine and an electric TRU? Catherine or Lorenzo, would either of you be able to answer on the incentives?
I can answer. There are incentives available to help offset the higher TRU equipment costs and the early infrastructure costs as well. Some of these programs include like the Clean Off-Road Equipment Voucher Incentive Project, Carl Moyer program, just two examples of programs that help fund both TRUs and infrastructure. There's a TRU funding webpage we have. Not all of these funding programs are necessarily CARB specific, but there are funding opportunities on that page that I would encourage you or anyone that's interested in TRU funding to take a look at. And it looks like Alyssa just dropped that in the chat. Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank you, Lorenzo. We have a comment here in the chat, James Frey. There are new California codes on the books that require capacity to be installed during new construction for certain building types with loading spaces. See Cal Green Title 24, Section 5.106.5.4. Thanks, James. So, not seeing any questions. I got another question for you guys if you're able to provide any feedback on it for us. We talked about zero emission certifications and assurances on slide 41. What types of protections or processes would you like to see for this? All right, looks like we're not getting any responses. If that's something that you'd like to either communicate with us via email or set up a meeting privately to discuss, we can go down that route as well. just reach out to our freight email. That's freight@arb.ca.gov. Since it doesn't look like we're getting any additional questions at this time, we're going to move on to the next section of the presentation. Alyssa, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Sam. All right, so we'll now talk about some next steps that we're planning and a few helpful resources for you all. So our next steps are to continue meeting with interested stakeholders and also having further discussions on technology and operations and the potential concepts. We're planning to consider your feedback from today and to start working to refine the concepts for further consideration. Staff are planning to present updated concepts in the spring of next year at the next workshop. And this would tentatively cover refined concepts, what implementation may look like. We plan to share some initial cost estimates, and we'll also solicit alternatives. Staff are also tentatively planning to hold some dedicated workshops on the baseline emissions inventory, and the tentative timing for that is summer of 2024. So again, our goal is to get this measure to the board for consideration by 2026. So here's some useful resources for you all. And then if you download the slides from our webpage, and hopefully they're there, you can access the links directly from them. So we have a webpage that lists all the incentives that can be used to apply for zero-emission TRUs and zero-emission infrastructure. And we've also dropped that in the chat a few times. Here's our TRU program page, and this has the latest news and information on TRUs. And then you can also visit the truck stop page, and this includes several truck-related resources that might also impact TRU fleets. And if you have any additional questions or any that we didn't get to today, or if you would just like to share written comments or data with us, you can send them to our freight@arb.ca.gov email, or please feel free to directly email myself, Alyssa Rhodes@arb.ca.gov, or our manager, Stephanie Huber @arb.ca.gov. And then if you would like to stay up to date with all of the developments that are coming for TRU Part 2, please subscribe to our listserv. That link's clickable on this slide, and I think we can drop that in the chat too. We do have a quick 4-question survey for you all before you go that we would encourage everyone to please fill out. It's just some questions for you all to share with us how you felt that our workshop went today, and filling it out would help us to improve the experience for you all going forward. And then on this survey, you can also let us know if you would like to meet with us and share information privately. So we'd like to dedicate a few minutes now just for you all to fill it out. And then you can scan the QR code on the screen, and then the link to that will be dropped in the chat. Or if you would prefer to fill it out later, you can also download the slides and it will be on there. So we'll now have like maybe 2 to 3 minutes for you all to fill it out, and then we'll conclude after.